The dress fit perfectly. That was the problem. Margot Ellison had spent 45 minutes in front of the mirror convincing herself of this fact, that the deep burgundy wrap dress she'd ordered online 3 weeks ago, the one she'd almost returned twice, actually looked the way she'd hoped it would. And it did. She knew it did. But knowing something and feeling it are two entirely different wars, and standing in the elevator of the Whitmore Grand Hotel on a Tuesday evening in November, surrounded by mirrored walls that reflected her from every merciless angle, Margot was losing both. She was 31 years old, 5'4", and had been plus size since she was 19. When stress and a thyroid condition and 2 years of terrible cafeteria food had reshaped her body into something her mother called fuller and her college boyfriend at the time called a phase. She'd spent the better part of a decade learning to move through the world without apologizing for the space she occupied. Some days she was very good at it. Tonight was not one of those days. The elevator opened on the 32nd floor and released her into the kind of event that made regular people feel like they'd wandered into someone else's life. The Whitmore's annual Acquisitions Gala was technically a networking event for finance, but in practice it was a performance, a stage for the city's most powerful people to remind each other exactly who they were. Chandeliers dripped light onto silk and crystal. Women who looked like they subsisted exclusively on sparkling water moved in careful orbits around men in bespoke suits. A string quartet played something that sounded expensive in the corner. Margot was there because she was the best financial analyst at Kellner and Price, and her firm expected its people to be seen at events like this. She was there because in 3 years she had turned 2 struggling portfolios into flagships and earned every right to stand in this room. She was there because she had worked for it. She repeated this to herself as she accepted a glass of water from a passing tray and tried to decide where to begin. She had just started toward the far end of the room, where the actual industry people congregated, away from the decorative socialites, when she heard it. Margot. She turned slowly. She had learned over the years to never turn fast toward a voice she didn't want to hear. Connor Ashby was standing near the bar with 2 other men she didn't recognize, holding a Scotch glass, and wearing the particular expression he always wore when he wanted someone to know he'd spotted them. He was 34, blonde in an aggressively maintained way, and had the posture of a man who'd been told he was exceptional for so long he'd simply accepted it as geological fact. He had also, for 8 months 2 years ago, been the person Margot had thought she might actually build something with. "Connor," she said. He closed the distance between them with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once worried about how he crossed a room. The 2 men stayed at the bar, watching with the mild curiosity of people at a zoo. "I didn't know Kellner was sending people tonight," he said. "We send people every year." "Right." He looked at her the way she remembered, that slow, cataloguing look that she'd once mistaken for admiration. "You," he paused, and the pause was its own sentence. "The same." Margot said nothing, actually. He tilted his head. "You might have." Another pause. He had always been skilled at the pause, at letting the silence do the cruelty, so he could claim innocence later. "Did you gain weight?" She heard one of the men at the bar shift his weight. Somewhere behind her, a woman laughed at something else entirely. The string quartet moved into a new piece. "I'm asking because I care," Connor added, with the particular softness of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "You were already, you know. It's a health thing, Margot. I'm not trying to be unkind." There were things she could have said. She had a list of them, had been building it, actually, in the back of her mind for 2 years, because some part of her had always known that this city was small enough that she'd eventually end up in a room with him again. She had the words. She had the composure. She even had the low heels that put her at the exact right height to hold eye contact without looking up at him. What she didn't have, in this particular moment, was the energy to perform being unbothered, because she wasn't unbothered. She was 31 years old in a dress she'd spent 45 minutes convincing herself looked good. and her ex-boyfriend had just said the word wait at her in a room full of people, in the particular tone of someone offering medical advice, and it sat in her chest the way those things always did. Not like a slap, but like a slow leak. She turned away from him without answering. Not fleeing, she was very deliberate about her pace, but moving because she needed the other side of this room, and she needed it now. She made it approximately 12 feet before she stopped. She stopped because she had nearly walked directly into a man. He was standing in a gap between two conversation clusters, slightly apart from everything the way certain people are, not isolated, but contained, tall, dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open in a way that read less like casualness and more like a declaration that he dressed for himself and not for the room. Dark hair, olive skin, the kind of face that photographers would describe as strong, and everyone else would just stare at. He was holding a glass of something amber and watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "I'm sorry," she said, because she'd almost collided with him. "I wasn't. Who was that?" His voice was low, direct. Not the voice of someone making conversation, the voice of someone who had already decided the conversation mattered. Margot blinked. "Excuse me," the man at the bar. His eyes, dark, focused, moved briefly past her shoulder. "The one who just said what he said to you." She felt something tighten in her throat. "You heard that? Enough of it." She almost laughed, but it came out as something flatter. "He's no one. An ex." The man looked at her for a moment. Not the cataloguing look Connor used. This was something different, more like assessment, like he was deciding something. "Your drink is empty," he said, and nodded at her water glass, which was in fact nearly gone. "I wasn't. I'm fine. I know you're fine." His tone made it sound like that was never in question. "I'm offering you a reason to stay in this corner and not have to walk back past him." Margot looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her glass. Then she handed it to a passing server and accepted the fresh one he signaled for almost immediately, with the ease of someone who'd never once had to wait for service in his life. "Thank you," she said. "Stellan Vance," he said, not quite offering his hand, offering his name, which, in this room, was the harder currency. The name landed in her chest with a small thud of recognition. Stellan Vance, Vance Capital, the private investment firm that had quietly acquired 3 of the largest commercial real estate portfolios in the Northeast over the past 18 months, including 2 that her firm had been watching. He was the kind of name that came up in briefings, not at parties. "Margot Ellison," she said, "Kellner and Price." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "The Hargrove portfolio, that was mine, yes. I read the restructuring analysis a bit. It was the best piece of financial writing I've read in 4 years." Margot had received a lot of compliments in professional settings. Most of them felt like being handed something lukewarm. This one landed differently, probably because he said it the same way he said everything else, with no apparent interest in whether it pleased her. Just a fact he had decided to share. "You're in the wrong industry," he added. "I'm in exactly the right industry," she said, and he looked at her again, that same assessing look, and this time she was almost certain. Something in it shifted towards something that wasn't just professional. They talked for 22 minutes. She knew this because she checked her watch when it ended, and then did the math backward. 22 minutes about the Hargrove restructuring, about interest rate environments, about a small municipal bond situation in Philadelphia that she'd been tracking and that he, it turned out, had been watching from a different angle. She forgot for 22 minutes that she had walked across this room to escape something. She forgot to think about her dress. She didn't forget Connor Ashby, but he receded. When she finally excused herself to do the actual networking she'd come here for, Stellan Vance said, "Enjoy your evening, Margot Ellison," and something about the way he said her full name, careful, like he meant to keep it, stayed with her longer than she wanted it to. She was halfway through a conversation with a portfolio manager from Meridian when she saw Connor again. He had apparently spent the 22 minutes gathering reinforcements. He was now standing with a woman Margot recognized, Priya Mehta, who worked at a competing firm and had always been fine, pleasant, professionally cordial, and two other men, and they were all looking at Margot with the particular energy of people who'd been talking about her. Connor caught her eye and smiled. Then he said something to the group, and Priya glanced away, and one of the men actually laughed. Margot continued her conversation with the portfolio manager. Her hands were steady. This was something she had gotten very good at, continuing in the face of being the subject of a joke she wasn't meant to hear. But she felt it. She felt it in the familiar way, the way she'd been feeling it since she was 22, and first learned that her body was something other people felt entitled to have opinions about, the way it settled into the spaces behind her ribs and made her feel simultaneously too large and completely invisible, which was the specific cruelty of it, being seen only for the thing they wanted to reduce you to, nothing else. She wrapped up the conversation, excused herself, and went to find the one place in any large building that she'd learned was almost always empty during parties, the library. The Whitmore Grand had one, a small, dark, wood-paneled room off the main corridor that was technically part of the hotel's private club floor, and technically off-limits to gala guests. The door was unlocked. Margot had noticed this on her way in, because she always noticed exits. She slipped inside and let the door close behind her. The room smelled like old paper and furniture polish, and the faint ghost of cigars from some other decade. Bookshelves lined 3 walls. A pair of leather chairs sat near a fireplace that wasn't lit. A single lamp was on in the corner, casting everything in amber. She sat in one of the chairs, set her drink on the side table, and pressed her fingers briefly over her eyes. She wasn't crying. She needed to be clear with herself about that. She wasn't crying. She was just resetting. There was a difference. She had learned the difference the hard way, over years of refusing to let people like Connor Ashby cost her more than they were worth. She heard the door. She startled, pulled her hands from her face and straightened, and Stellan Vance walked into the room like he'd known she'd be there. He paused when he saw her. "The library," he said. "I'm sorry, I know this floor is probably. I'm a member of the club." He said it simply, without emphasis. "I come here when I've had enough of the room." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. There was something different about seeing him in the quieter light of this room. The noise and performance of the gala stripped away, just the lamp and the bookshelves and the faint sound of the city 32 floors below. He crossed the room without invitation and sat in the other chair. "Tell me what that was about," he said. It wasn't Margot. Just her first name. Quiet. "Tell me." She didn't know why she did. She told herself later it was because she was tired, which was true. She told herself it was because the room felt removed from everything, like a parenthesis, which was also true. She didn't entirely let herself think about the other reason, that there was something about the way he listened, completely still, eyes on her face, like her words were the only thing in the room, that made her want to actually say things. So she told him. Not the entire 2 years. She wasn't in the business of oversharing, but the shape of it, Connor. The relationship that had seemed like it was going somewhere until it became clear what he thought of her. The ways he'd made her feel like she needed to be smaller in order to deserve things. The specific cruelty of running into him here, in this room, in front of people, in a dress she'd been proud of 20 minutes before he opened his mouth. When she finished, the room was quiet. Stellan set his glass down on the table beside his chair. He was looking at her with an expression she still hadn't entirely figured out, intent and steady and something else underneath it that she couldn't name. "He's wrong," he said. "I know he's wrong. I don't think you entirely believe that right now." She opened her mouth to disagree and then didn't, because that was the kind of thing she didn't want to lie about in a room this quiet. "He called it a health concern," she said, instead of admitting he was right. "He always does that, framing it as worry. Like he's doing you a favor. Men like that aren't worried about your health." Stellan's voice was even. "They're worried about their own discomfort with things they can't control, with women who exist in ways they haven't approved. She looked at him. "You wrote the best financial analysis I've read in 4 years," he said again. "You walked into that room tonight like you belonged in it, because you do. You have been the most interesting person I've spoken to in—" He paused, and the pause was nothing like Connor's pauses. It was just thinking, "A long time, actually. You don't have to." "I'm not." His voice was firm but not unkind. "I don't say things I don't mean, Margot. I find it inefficient." Something that had been clenched in her chest for the last hour, maybe longer, maybe since the elevator, loosened slightly. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect, Stellan Vance?" She almost smiled. "I expected someone who had read the Hargrove analysis and had notes." "I do have notes," he said. "I was going to bring them up later." And she did smile then properly, and he looked at her the way the light in this room made everything look like it mattered. They stayed in the library for a long time. She didn't check her watch. They talked about the work, the Philadelphia situation, a tax structure she'd been puzzling over, a fund he was considering restructuring, and somewhere in the middle of it the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when two people forget to be careful, and became something less professional and more like two people discovering what they had in common. He'd grown up in Minnesota. His father was a civil engineer. He had strong opinions about airport architecture and had never learned to make coffee correctly and had read every book on the shelf behind her left shoulder, or so he claimed. "You're lying about the Trollope," she said. "The Victorian novel, the Victorian novelist. There are 4 of them there. You have not read 4 Anthony Trollope novels." "I read 2, he admitted. "The other 2 I started. That's not reading them. That's a technicality. That is the entire point of a technicality." He looked at her with something she finally identified. It was the look of someone who was genuinely happy to be exactly where they were. She noticed, at some point, that an hour had passed, and neither of them had mentioned going back to the gala. It was close to 10 o'clock when the door opened. Connor Ashby walked in with the specific energy of someone who had been looking for something and was pleased to have found it. He had 2 other men with him, the same ones from the bar, and he was smiling the smile Margot recognized as the one that meant he felt he had an audience. "There you are," he said, directed at Margot. Then he clocked Stellan in the other chair, and something flickered across his face. Recalibration. "Sorry, didn't realize this room was occupied." He did not sound sorry. Stellan said nothing. He didn't move. He just looked at Connor with the level attention of someone who had correctly identified what he was dealing with and was in no hurry. "We were just leaving," Connor said, though he showed no signs of leaving. "Margot, you should come back in. Priya wanted to talk to you about the Meridian thing." "Priya can find me," Margot said. Connor's smile shifted slightly. "Right." He glanced at Stellan again, doing the math. "I didn't realize you 2 knew each other." "We do," Stellan said. His voice was entirely neutral. Connor looked between them. The 2 men behind him were suddenly very interested in the bookshelves. "Well," Connor said, falling back on charm, "I was just saying earlier, Margot's one of the sharpest analysts in the city. Kellner's lucky to have her." The sentence landed exactly the way it was designed to, as a public rehabilitation of himself, a retroactive kindness offered to the room. "See? I said something nice. No hard feelings." Stellan set down his glass. "The sharper observation," he said, "is that Kellner is the lucky one." He stood. He was taller than Connor by 2 inches, which was not a large difference, but became one in the particular way he occupied the space. And I'd suggest that anyone in this industry would do well to remember that Margot Ellison is the reason the Hargrove portfolio exists in its current form, which, if you've been following the numbers, has outperformed the market by 11% this quarter. Silence. Connor's smile had gone somewhere and not come back. "I didn't," he started. "Earlier this evening," Stellan said, still in that same calm register, "you spoke to her in a way that was beneath you. More importantly, it was beneath her. I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether you want that kind of reputation in a room where everyone knows everyone." A pause that was nothing like Connor's pauses. This one was clean, unhurried, certain. This is a small industry. Connor left. The two men left with him, with the speed of people who had not signed up for whatever that was. The door closed. The library was quiet again. Margot looked at Stellan. He picked up his glass. He seemed entirely unbothered by what had just happened, which was in itself a kind of answer about what he was. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. He's going to be insufferable about it. Let him." He looked at her. "You were already the most interesting person in that room. You were already the reason the Hargrove portfolio is what it is. He didn't change any of that tonight, and neither did I." He paused. "I just made it harder for him to pretend otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. 31 years old, standing in a borrowed library at a gala she'd almost skipped, wearing a dress she'd been proud of before someone tried to take that away from her, and finding, in the strange, parenthetical way that things sometimes found you, someone who looked at her like she was exactly enough. "You have notes on the Hargrove analysis," she said. "I want to hear them." The corner of his mouth moved. "Dinners. Thursday. That's not a question." "No," he agreed. She picked up her drink. The gala noise filtered faintly through the walls, someone's laughter, the far-off music. In here it was still and warm, and she was exactly the size she was, and the room held her without apology. "Thursday," she said. 3 weeks later, Connor Ashby's name came up in a conversation Margot wasn't part of. Something about a compliance issue, a conflict of interest that someone had finally, after a long time, decided to examine closely. She didn't know the specifics. She didn't need them. What she knew was this, that the Hargrove portfolio's Q4 numbers had just come in, and they were better than projected, and that Stellan Vance had texted her a screenshot of the report at 7:43 in the morning with the single word 11, a callback to the number he'd cited in the library that night, which meant he'd been thinking about that night at 7:43 in the morning, and that knowledge sat warm in her chest all day. She knew that on Thursday he'd had actual notes, printed, annotated in pen, which she had not expected, and that they'd stayed at the restaurant until it closed, and then stood outside on the sidewalk for another 40 minutes, because neither of them was willing to stop the conversation, and that the second dinner had been her suggestion, and the third had been his, and somewhere between the fourth and the fifth she had stopped thinking of them as dinners, and started thinking of them as just time. She knew that he had a way of saying her name, just Margot, not performative, not careful, just hers, that made it sound like he'd been holding on to it. And she knew, on a cold Friday in December, when she walked into a room for the first time in her adult life, without adjusting herself in advance, without the small internal bracing, without the apologetic recalibration she'd been doing so long she'd stopped noticing it, that something had shifted. Not because of him, not entirely. Because the shift happens from the inside, she knew that now. But sometimes you need someone to stand in a room and say the thing out loud. She belongs here, she always has, before you can fully let yourself believe it. She had spent years moving through the world carefully, taking up only as much space as she'd been permitted. She had been good at it. She had been so good at it. But Stellan Vance had looked at her in a library on a Tuesday night and listened like her words were worth keeping, and somewhere in that she had remembered that she had never actually needed permission. She took up her space, all of it, without flinching, and the room, as it turned out, was large enough.